There's a travel advisory that came out of the State Department this week that's getting a lot of attention, and for good reason. It's not the kind of advisory that says, be cautious or monitor local news. It's the kind that says, get out now and don't expect us to come get you if things go sideways.
The message is short and to the point, quote, leave Iran now, have a plan for departing Iran that does not rely on the U.S. government help. This follows President Trump's warning to the Islamic Republic as reports reveal hundreds of civilians have been killed during anti-government protests.
Now, if you've been following U.S.-Iran relations for any length of time, you know that tensions between Washington and Tehran aren't exactly new. But what's happening right now is being framed by a lot of people as either the beginning of something catastrophic or as routine posturing that'll blow over in a few weeks. And here's what people misunderstand. It's probably neither of those things, but it's also not nothing. Let me walk you through what actually just happened, why the regime in Tehran is facing pressure it hasn't seen in years, and what the U.S. is actually weighing right now.
The White House also revealing the private messages Iran is sending back to the United States. Watch this.
What the Iranian regime is saying publicly is quite different from the messages they are sending to the United States.
So let's start with the facts. President Trump issued a warning to the Islamic Republic. The White House has gone public with the fact that Iran is sending private messages to Washington. And those messages, according to U.S. officials, don't match what the regime is saying publicly. That gap between private and public messaging is important, and we'll come back to that.
In the Trump administration privately, President Trump, as for him, he has always expressed that diplomacy is the first option, always has been, always will be. However, he is unafraid to use the lethal force and might of the United States military if and when he deems that necessary, and nobody knows that better than the Iranian regime.
But first, let's clarify what the travel advisory actually means. When the State Department tells Americans to leave a country and specifically says, do not rely on U.S. government assistance, that's a signal. It's not a declaration of war. It's not a guarantee that military action is imminent. What it is a recognition that if things escalate, the U.S. government's ability to extract civilians from Iran is extremely limited. Iran doesn't have an embassy relationship with the United States. There's no consular presence. There's no infrastructure for evacuations. So if you're an American in Iran and something happens, you're on your own. That's the reality the State Department is making explicit. Now, why issue that warning now? That's where things get complicated. Inside Iran right now, there's a level of domestic unrest that's been building for months. The protests we're seeing aren't new, but the scale and the regime's response are escalating.
Those who have been able to get their message out to the outside world do say that there are many Iranians who are still dedicated and committed to this cause despite this ongoing violence against them. Where do you think these protests stand right now? And could this moment...
A communication blackout. That's not a move you make if you're confident in your control. That's a move you make when you're trying to prevent coordination, prevent information from getting out, and prevent the outside world from seeing what's happening on the ground. And the reason the regime is resorting to that level of control is because the pressure they're facing isn't just political. It's economic, it's environmental, and it's existential.
The regime is under more threat right now domestically than they ever have been before. I think that's reflected in the outreach on the part of the Ayatollah to the United States for some negotiations, potentially about the nuclear program. Iran knows that their economy is in free fall. They're suffering from a shortage of water. All of those things have fueled these protests, and it threatens Iran's regime. And so what they want is to negotiate and put an end to those sanctions. I think the Trump administration will certainly listen. It's a good opportunity for us to collect information on how bad things are inside Iran. But I think the Trump administration might do well to let these protests play out and not be in a rush to eliminate or reduce those sanctions, which are having such a serious impact on the regime's security.
Let's pause there, because this is critical context. The Iranian economy isn't just struggling, it's in free fall. Sanctions have been choking revenue. The currency has collapsed. Basic resources like water are becoming scarce in parts of the country. And when people can't feed their families, when they can't access basic services, protests stop being about ideology and start being about survival. That's a dangerous combination for any government, but especially for a government like Iran's, which derives its legitimacy not from democratic elections, but from a combination of religious authority and state force. Now, the Trump administration is making it very clear that they see this moment as an opportunity to increase pressure.
Pay a tariff of 25% on any and all business being done with the United States of America. This order is final and conclusive. And this whole protest started as an economic protest.
Tariffs on any country doing business with Iran. That's not a subtle policy. That's maximum pressure. The goal is to isolate Iran economically, to the point where either the regime changes its behavior or the domestic pressure becomes unsustainable. But here's where we need to separate what's being discussed from what's being decided.
So I think we have a number of options. I think the president is going to be looking at, obviously, the military option to strike IRGC facilities. They're the ones that they're bringing down the oppression on those protesters. That's certainly an option. Cyber strikes is another one, delivering internet to the Iranian people so that they can coordinate these protests. And of course, we've seen the sanctions increase further. And remember, the targeted countries are India, China, and Russia, those countries that do business with Iran. I'm sure that the president is going to be receiving an intelligence briefing from Director CIA Ratcliffe on exactly where these pain points are and how the CIA might assess Iran would react, the impact on domestic unrest inside the country. Lots of very heavy, weighty decisions for the administration today. The president will have his team around him to try to make the best decisions possible.
Military strikes on IRGC facilities are being looked at. That's what the reporting says. But looking at and planning to execute are not the same thing. The administration is weighing options. That includes sanctions, that includes intelligence operations, and yes, that includes the possibility of military action. But military strikes inside Iran are not a light decision. They carry enormous risks: regional destabilization, the potential for Iranian retaliation against U.S. forces in the region, the possibility of escalation into a broader conflict. These are the kinds of decisions that don't get made casually, and the fact that they're being discussed doesn't mean they're imminent. What is clear is that the administration is signaling to Tehran that all options are on the table. That's a form of deterrence. It's also a form of pressure. Now, inside Iran, the regime is responding to this pressure in predictable ways.
Of a 26-year-old Iranian who is set to be hanged later today. It would be the first public execution of this round of protesting. I mean, the resolve of people who are willing to die.
A 26-year-old Iranian set to be hanged. The first public execution tied to this current wave of protests. This is the regime sending a message to its own population. Dissent will be met with the harshest possible consequences. Public executions aren't about justice. They're about fear. They're about demonstrating control in a moment when that control is being challenged. And the fact that the regime feels the need to go this far tells you something about how threatened they actually feel.
The Obama administration did that with the JCPOA, failed nuclear agreement. We've tried to influence Iran's behavior in the region with their support to proxy terrorists, their ballistic missile program, their nuclear program. I think the question is whether now it's time for maybe regime change that would ultimately provide an opportunity for more, for real long-term change in their behavior. I'm not sure you get to one without the other. The question I have going forward is the extent to which the IRGC is going to stay loyal to this regime, which is just full of rot. And that, I think, is what the Trump administration will be looking at. Iran is arguably the root of just about all the evil in the Middle East. And when you look at all the challenges we face from Hamas to Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iran is at the center of it all.
So now we get to the big question. Is this about regime change? There are people in Washington, and there have been for years, who believe that the only way to achieve lasting stability in the Middle East is to see the current government in Tehran replaced, whether that's through internal collapse, through external pressure, or through some combination of both. And there's a real question right now about how loyal the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, will remain if the domestic situation continues to deteriorate. The IRGC is the backbone of the regime's power. If that loyalty fractures, everything changes. But here's what we need to be very clear about. Regime change is not a policy. It's an outcome. And the path to that outcome is extraordinarily unpredictable. The United States does not have good options for forcing regime change in Iran without triggering a conflict that could engulf the region. The Iranian government, for all its dysfunction, still has significant military capabilities, significant influence through proxy groups across the Middle East, and the ability to make life very difficult for U.S. interests in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and beyond. So when people ask, is the U.S. planning regime change in Iran? The answer is more complicated than yes or no. What the U.S. is doing is applying maximum pressure and hoping that internal dynamics inside Iran do the work that external force cannot. That's a strategy. It's not a guarantee. Now let's talk about why this moment feels different. Part of it is the sheer level of coordination between economic pressure, public messaging, and the willingness to at least discuss military options. The Trump administration is not being subtle about any of this.
In the Trump administration privately, President Trump, as for him, he has always expressed that diplomacy is the first option, always has been, always will be. However, he is unafraid to use the lethal force and might of the United States military if and when he deems that necessary. And nobody knows that better than the Iranian regime.
The fact that the White House is revealing that Iran's private messages don't match their public rhetoric is itself a tactic. It's designed to undermine Tehran's credibility, both internationally and domestically. It's designed to show that the regime is more afraid than it's letting on. And the calculation behind the travel advisory, behind the tariffs, behind the military discussions, is that if you apply enough pressure in enough places at the same time, something breaks. Maybe it's the economy, maybe it's internal cohesion within the government, maybe it's the patience of the Iranian people. But that calculation also comes with enormous risk. Because if the regime feels cornered, if it feels like collapse is imminent, it may decide that the least bad option is to lash out, to escalate, to try to change the equation through force. That's the scenario everyone is trying to avoid, but it's also the scenario that becomes more likely the more pressure you apply. So where does that leave us? What we know is this. The United States has issued a clear warning to American citizens in Iran. The administration is increasing economic pressure and signaling that military options are under consideration. Inside Iran, the regime is cracking down on protests with increasing brutality, while also privately signaling to Washington that it understands the stakes. What we don't know is how this resolves. We don't know if the pressure will be enough to change Iran's behavior. We don't know if the regime will collapse under its own weight or dig in and survive. We don't know if this escalates into something much larger or if it fades into another cycle of tension and negotiation. What I can tell you is that the next few weeks are going to be critical. How the regime responds to domestic unrest, how the international community responds to U.S. pressure, and how Iran's regional proxies choose to act, all of that will determine whether this moment is remembered as a turning point or just another chapter in a very long standoff. Pay attention, this isn't over.